I think it's all over to you guys. Yep, live stream's working. Ready for you, Sean.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Rob. Right. I invite the Prime Minister.
Hey everyone, just give me a moment to just grab my notes and my timer. Okay. Okay. Start. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. The coming together of South Korea and Japan is already in motion. The Americans want it to happen. These countries have too many common interests to be apart for long. But importantly in this debate, it is not an inevitability. The question of this round is, should South Korea flow where the gravity of international politics is pulling it, or should they attempt to fight that gravity as side negative must defend? The first thing I'll do in this debate is outline the interests of the actor in question. The second thing I'll do is explain what it would look like to pursue closer economic and diplomatic ties and what the other side must defend. And then I'll provide 2 arguments. Onto the first is a question. What is the interest of the actor? We would note that South Korea has 2 main priorities. The first and most important, or first priority is to secure prosperity for the South Korean people, which is to say the country becoming wealthier, their purchasing power on the global stage, improving their prestige that flows from being a wealthy country coming from that. And we would note that although South Korea has grown quite rapidly, it is still, in global terms, not that rich. It is still a middle-income country. The second thing we would point to here as the broad interest of the actor is that of security, which is to say the existence of South Korea began with a war which has never formally declared a ceasefire. North Korea's large backer, China, still encircle and threaten South Korean security every day. The North Koreans dream of a time where they could kill South Korean children. The second point of setup here is about what does it look like to pursue this particular agreement. We would note a couple of things. On the economic front, it would look things like trying to sign free trade agreements. It would look like making commitments to invest certain amounts of money in each other's economy. It would look like partnership deals between large South Korean and Japanese companies, sort of grandfathered in by the governments on both sides, and would look like perhaps purchase guarantees with South Korean company or South Korean governments, for example, guarantees to purchase Japanese products and vice versa. On the diplomatic front, it would look like continuing the trend that's already gone on, because obviously while there are disagreements of the past, there has been some progress. We point to the 98 Joint Declaration, the 2015 Declaration about Comfort Women. We point to the fact that Yoon Suk-yeol's government has made this a clear priority. They've established a clear working group, and Park Jin has regularly visited Japan, regularly visited Turkey in an attempt to move in this, which means that underside negative, the diplomatic posture South Korea must take must include an explanation as to why they're departing from the set of priorities the government has already outlined vis-a-vis the relationship with Japan. The third thing we note, though, in terms of setup here about why this is what this would work is it would just look like collaborating with trilateral agreements the Americans are very interested in setting up. Like, it's a priority of the Biden administration to run things trilaterally. Blinken is constantly insisting they do trilateral meetings, trilateral military exercises, etc., which means not only does this process of normalizing relations likely to have a lot of American support, but importantly, under their side, they would have to explain to the Americans why they're insisting on bilateral relationships between South Korea and America and resisting US efforts to bring the countries together, which, as we'll explain later, comes with a political cost. Okay, let's discuss the economy. We have 4 main reasons as to why it's quite likely these countries would benefit economically from being closer together. The first is that they have the two economies are similar enough to have a large degree of capacity for economic integration. We point to the fact that 1, they have large manufacturing sectors and operate in similar areas, but also 2, they have large domestic consumer bases, all of whom want products, which means there's a significant degree of capacity for products to be made in South Korea or Japan and sold in the other country. You can form partnerships between companies and, diversify and make your supply chains far more resilient. We would point to the global context where supply chains have been incredibly disrupted due to war and disease, and note that there's likely to be a large amount of benefit that can be achieved immediately by encouraging those partnerships between countries. And notably, individual companies may struggle to articulate those agreements or worry about the regulatory risk involved in trying to make those agreements, but the governments coming together and talking about this removes that regulatory risk for those companies and encourages them to get working on their own. The second observation we'd make about why these countries are likely to be economically aligned is they're just geographically quite proximate, and that reduces the cost of transportation of tremendous amount. It makes everything far, far easier. There's a reason human beings gather together to live in cities, because being close together means you can be far more productive and you can have greater access to things. The other implication of them being geographically proximate is they have a shared history a lot of the time. There's obviously, quite a bit of crossover, which means that consumers are often likely to have similar tastes and preferences, which means there's a fair amount of overlapping there. They could, for example, negotiate for certain food products together, or, a variety of other, use your imagination to imagine how those synergies might exist. The third observation we'd make is actually one about the financial sector, which is to say, decades of low interest rates and indicate to the fact that Japan has a tremendous amount of free capital that is not being currently utilized, and the Japanese pension funds are like notoriously very, very large and struggle to put that capital to work. We would note the most common barrier to like moving money overseas and expanding the ability of that capital to be put to work is things like regulation and a non-aligned financial sector, which what we would say is a key area the South Korean government could target here is aligning their financial sector and the regulations of Japan, and Japan doing the same for South Korea, which can unlock a tremendous amount of investment, because Japan can take the capital which is not being properly utilized and has very low rates of return in Japan, and then move it to South Korea, which is a far more dynamic economy. There is far more opportunity for return, and they can unlock a tremendous amount of growth, given that South Korea potentially is quite capital constrained. The fourth observation is just kind of an observation that these countries share kind of similar economic problems, and that together they could potentially make some progress here. The first is to do with that both countries suffer from very large conglomerates, which obviously were perhaps quite important in the past in making these countries more prosperous, but they suffer from a series of observations. A series of problems. One, they tend to be run by central large families, which make them often quite inefficient and often quite, subject to nepotism at the top. Two, they're often extremely inefficient because they're conglomerates. They're trying to produce like 50 different products in different markets. They often lack expertise, but they provide efficiency. But three, the reason as to why they've been able to remain inefficient but so large is because they are so powerful and have so much, history and money. They're often quite influential local politics. We would point out it's probably quite likely that the South Korean government doesn't have the political will or political ability to seriously break the local South Korean conglomerates. But the same is also true for the Japanese economy. If together the two governments could potentially make some progress in pushing that down the line. This other thing we know is obviously they both suffer from a very serious declining birth rate and demographic problem. And just sharing information, trying to share solutions there, a closer cooperation could be really important. The impact of this argument is obviously everyone in South Korea gets far more richer under our side. It's far more likely to. They're able to make their supply chains more resilient. They're less subject to things like shocks, like economic shocks, or from pressure from China. That is obviously quite beneficial. The other side needs responses as to why they get those benefits. Secondly, on the question of diplomacy and politics, we'd obviously point to all the stuff I've already set up in my intro about why this is moving forward, but we'd also point to the fact that right now within Japan, since Shinzo Abe's assassination, the hawkish wing of the LDP is highly discredited. And the reason for that is the reason Abe was assassinated because of his association with a cult, and the assassination increased people's knowledge within Japan of the cult and really discredited all of the hawkish wing within the LDP, which means, given that those guys are the guys who are often most insistent about not apologizing to the women, now is a particularly useful time for the South Korean government to try and push that issue and try and extract symbolic concessions from the Japanese government. So what benefits we have from security? South Korea both strong security, and so is Japan. They have similarly sized militaries. They can conduct joint exercises. They can monitor China's fishing fleets and activity in the outlying islands. They can obviously do things like very important things like missile tracking from the North Koreans, which is obviously incredibly important for both countries. We would also point out that South Korea was originally inside the Quad, but the US was worried about South Korea-Japan tensions and move them outside the Quad. So South Korea becoming closer with Japan will enable them to join the Quad and gain a greater degree of military cooperation and the access to technology that the Quad provides. The impact here is South Koreans are significantly safer, they're significantly closer to the US and Japan, they're less out in the cold. Side negative, need a response to that issue. Incredibly proud.
Right. I thank Prime Minister for that speech. Invite Elo.
Hello, just checking you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I'm going to do 4 things in this speech. Firstly, I'll explain why South Korea has independent, non-practical reasons why they would never enter into these kinds of close ties. Secondly, I'll talk about domestic political harms. Thirdly, I'll explain the opportunity costs to your relationship with China. And fourthly, I'll explain why this is not a particularly useful economic partnership anyway. Rebuttal will be integrated. First of all, why does this actor have non-practical reasons why they would never enter into these kinds of relationships? I'm starting with this because it is literally just the quickest way to understand why side negative will win this debate. Because even if you believe all of that speech, even if you believe all of the practical benefits that Brendon brings you, South Korea would still never do this. They have independent, like cultural and historical reasons why they would never enter into this kind of partnership. And the note that I want to make here is that Brendon just massively overstates the extent to which these countries are already becoming close. Like this, I think this team tries to paint this debate as though it's like, oh, well, they're already getting close, they just keep doing it. No. This would be a significant, significant change. It would require them to get a lot closer. They are only becoming closer and forgiving each other in small ways. So, first of all, South Korea and Japan have strong existing tensions. I'm going to explain 5 reasons why that is true. The first is that Japan has a history of having colonized South Korea. And the second thing to say is that over the course of that colonization, Japan committed an enormous amount of war crimes that massively harmed the South Korean people. And even when they were not actively in there as colonizers, the people that Japan installed as part of that colonization in South Korea continued to create harms to the South Korean people. Japan installed people in political offices who continue to create fracture, and that fracture still impacts South Korean people to this day. That has created an enormous harm to South Korea that they have not forgotten. But thirdly, this is worsened by the fact that Japan still deny many of these war crimes. They still deny the massive harms of their colonization of South Korea. Often they literally celebrate them as national holidays. And even where they have slowly started to acknowledge the harms of those kinds of things, as Brendon mentions, those are in incredibly small ways. And Japan continues to not acknowledge the scale of the harm that they caused to South Korea. Fourthly, there are ongoing current territorial disputes between these two countries. And South Korea, and importantly, South Korea sees this as the ongoing legacy of Japan's colonialism. So not only do they have territorial disputes that will make this partnership difficult, but South Korea sees that as an act of aggression from Japan and an act of colonial desire, and that is incredibly harmful. Fifthly, Japan harbors huge ethnic hatred towards South Koreans. Still, that is one of the ways in which they justify the enormous harm they did as part of the process of colonization and the enormous war crimes they did. They say, it doesn't matter because South Korean people are inferior to us. That is still something that goes on. All of that is to say, there are enormous tensions between South Korea and Japan that even if you believe that Japan would be okay with this relationship, South Korea, the actor that we are talking about in this debate, literally has enormous tensions with Japan. They feel as though they have been harmed by Japan, and Japan has never owned up to the enormous scale of harm that they caused them. The second thing I'm going to explain here is the reason why that means South Korea would not want a particularly close relationship with Japan in the way that the affirmative team describes. 3 things to say. The first is that this relationship, for the reasons that Brendon gives, would benefit Japan. And after the enormous harm that Japan did to South Korea, after the huge amounts of plunder and war crimes that they caused, Japan would not want to enter into a relationship that benefits the country that colonized them and will not own up to it. But second of all, now as part of this relationship, these two countries are forced to do a lot of signaling of friendships. They're forced to do things like release joint statements. They're forced to do things to signal to the businesses that they want to take up the free trade, that they're close again. That is something that they would not want to do for all of the reasons listed above. But thirdly, it signals forgiveness over something. It signals that whatever happened in the past is fine because they have moved on and they have created this relationship. South Korea would never want to do that because of the huge history that they have. And I'd just like to note a piece of weighing at the end of this argument, which is just that this is the most important issue in the debate for 2 reasons. First of all, it is entirely certain. We know with 100% certainty what the history of these two countries looks like. We know how South Korea feels about Japan. To the extent that the economic impacts are slightly speculative, you should default to the argument that you know is certain. But second of all, South Korea has one of the highest HDIs in the world. Do not listen to this affirmative team when they tell you that South Korea needs this economic partnership. They don't. Economic arguments are marginal in this debate. This is the clearest reason why the negative team will win this debate. Second argument then, why does it create domestic political harms? I'm going to explain 3 things. First of all, for all of the above reasons, the population of South Korea who remember the history of Japan's colonialism and colonization are likely to be incredibly unhappy with these kinds of partnership. And that is likely to create huge political instability in that country, which South Korea would not want. And I guess the note I'd make here is just that the wording of this motion is kind of confusing. It's unclear if this is 100% about the South Korean people or if it's 100% about the government. But in either case, that kind of domestic political instability is not in the interests of this country. Second of all, this is likely to empower the far right for the reason that South Korea already has a problem with the far right, and in the instance that these relationships go ahead, the far right will campaign aggressively on the fact that they would not have allowed this to happen, and that is likely to massively empower them. This is likely to be the tipping point for the far right gaining a huge amount of power, and we would say that is not in the interest of the South Korean people for a few reasons. First of all, the far right in South Korea literally trades on xenophobia that is likely to harm a huge amount of people in South Korea if they have more power. Second of all, the prosecution currently has total control over the police in South Korea. The far right are unwilling to fix that problem. It causes huge amounts of corruption that is likely to continue. If the far right gets power. But third of all, the far right is likely to do tax cuts for big business that will harm individual South Koreans, and that is a huge harm. All of that is to say that, independent of the economic benefits that this affirmative team wants to talk about, there are huge domestic political harms that are upstream of that South Korea is unlikely to want. The third thing to say is that big businesses in South Korea are likely to be harmed by this because it introduces a competitor. And Brendon explains the analysis when he says that these countries have similar economies. They both have a lot of high-tech businesses. This gives those companies an incentive to do lobbying, towards the government to stop them from doing deals like that in the future. That increases corporate lobbying. That is in general bad. Something South Korea probably doesn't want. For all those reasons, domestic political harms as a result of this policy are likely to be terrible. Thirdly, there is an opportunity cost here to your relationship with China. First of all, China does not have a particularly good relationship with Japan for a few reasons. The first is that Japan is currently trying to curtail Chinese aggression in other places. Like, for example, Japan has literally tried to change its constitution so that it can expand militarily to curb China's aggression. China sees Japan as a geopolitical threat. They don't like them for that reason. But second of all of the reasons of war crimes that I explained in the previous argument about South Korea also largely apply to China. There is a history of conflict between those countries with this Sino-Japanese war. That is bad. Thirdly, China is likely to perceive this partnership to be something that is created against them because, for the reason that Brendon explains, the US is likely to like it. They're likely to see it as a way to curb China's aggression. China is likely to see it as a threat. And the note that I'd make here is that China very often does use economic relationships for political ends. This suggests that they will punish South Korea for this. They are likely to look for new places. To support, and that is terrible. China is South Korea's biggest trading partner. South Korea has almost no access to fossil fuels without China. They need China's consumer market. If they lose that, that is crippling. Fourthly, then, why is this not a particularly useful partnership anyway? The first reason is that Japan's economy is already weak and it is getting weaker, which means this is not a particularly good economic partnership. First of all, the Bank of Japan literally refuses to raise interest rates. They're trying to prop up the yen by selling off huge amounts of reserves, which has put them in sort of a balance of payments crisis. Second of all, they have a huge amount of debt. Thirdly, they have an aging population, and fourthly, they're experiencing land shrinkage. All of that should suggest to you that this is a country that is particularly economically weak and is not a good trading partner. Secondly, though, South Korean firms and Japanese firms are unlikely to want to work with each other. So even if you can figure a trade arrangement, it's unlikely to be particularly effective because of all of the hatred I explained earlier. That is likely to fail. But thirdly, they have similar economies anyway for the reasons that Brendon explains. That means it's not a particular; those deals are not likely to be particularly effective. Incredibly proud to negate.
Right, thanks, Elo. I don't track past 8:15. Right, DPM.
Hello, am I audible? Is
Yep.
that a yes? I'm so sorry, Sean. I think that's a yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. South Korea is missing out on the type of relationship with Japan that befits two democratic US allied neighbors that share similar values, interests, and security concerns. We were the team that proved to you it was in South Korea's interest to pursue a closer economic and diplomatic relationship with Japan to enjoy the benefits that befit two nations of this description. So when Yoon Suk-yeol was going to pursue this relationship, it enabled South Korea to have agency in this process. It enabled them to jump aboard a train that was already churning, with the Biden administration significantly pushing for the gap between South Korea and Japan to be bridged in terms of Indo-Pacific relations. It allowed the historical pains and things that were festering within the South Korean population to finally have action and movement that brought people great joy, that brought them economic prosperity, and that brought them safety and security from dangers like North Korea and from being essentially beholden to the flippant will of China. We were so proud to support this policy. What are the interests of this actor? The first and only piece of analysis we get from that speaker is sort of an assertion that these actors aren't practical. Basically, the same sort of thing they tell you about why women are never good leaders, right? Like, oh, they're so emotional. Oh, historical things have happened to them that they're all mad and sad about. First response is clearly a lot of countries in the world have thriving economic and diplomatic relationships right now, even though they had historical wrongdoings occur between them. That suggests that there is a process of healing that is able to take place. That means that leaders can have the narrative to tell to their nation that shows, hey guys, yes, something did happen between me and Germany in the past. Obviously, we're all there for World War II, but Germany makes really good cars, and that's something that's going to benefit your lives, and that is why we have decided to shake hands and make a solution together. But uniquely in the South Korean context, it would be impossible to ever heal this relationship and be practical, or even be beholden to this historical pain without doing what we're telling you about on affirmative. So what I ask you as judges is to ask this, right? If South Korea's only concern in this debate is, as the negative team paints it, the very illogical one, like let's be illogical or be charitable to it, they only care about historical pain, we will still win this debate because they have not analyzed how they fix that historical pain by sitting there and digging their feet into the ground and just refusing to talk to Japan. So what do we do in terms of fixing history? The first thing to say is let's respond to their idea about existing tensions. They told you that colonization and war crimes was something that was particularly painful for South Korea. The first response to this is that both leaders right now, both Yoon Suk-yeol in South Korea and the Japanese leader, are trying to be pro-women, right? They're both trying to resolve these problems because they are kind of a big concern for a lot of women and a lot of people who are upset about the things like the comfort women that were used during the war that were basically acknowledged widely as being a human rights atrocity, right? So the thing that needs to be done for South Korea is to construct a shared and non-accusative narrative that allows multilateral inquiries into that violence against women, to allow the stories to actually be understood and studied, to allow the historical record to be set accurately. And right now it's impossible to do that because we have no level of cooperation from Japan. That means we are robbing the number one solution from our people, because it is necessary to have cooperation with Japan to even fully understand the extent of what happened, which is a big part of acknowledging people's pain. But step two of fixing this problem is also getting things like apologies or getting things like reparations. It would be absolutely inappropriate for South Korea to choose to pay these women reparations themselves. It needs to in some way come from Japan, and it needs to in some way have Japan's involvement, such as an acknowledgement of some sort of responsibility, such as the establishment of a shared fund from which these reparations could be paid. On their side of the house, that never happens. It is impossible because you aren't pursuing it. On our side of the house, you start pursuing it, you develop closer economic ties, you start to heal old wounds, you start to get on the phone with each other more, you show up to more multilateral and trilateral conversations. Even if the US is there in the room, at least you both are as well. And that develops the strength and the trust and the cooperation that can, in the end, lead to the solution that you need to heal these historical wounds. So it was illogical to state that an actor who cares about these historical wounds would not cooperate with Japan. An actor who cares about these historical wounds must cooperate with Japan in order to heal from them. And that was so important. So at the end of this point, I have shown you that if this is an enormous tension and the most important issue in the debate, ask yourself, should you never work together again, or should you start a bridge through which solutions can cross from one country to another? That side was the side that never had a bridge. Now, onto the economic point. They say basically Japan is not a good economy and is therefore not a good trading partner. The first thing to say is just because Japan has had problems with interest rates doesn't mean that it has no benefits that you can seek from its economy. We think that firstly, responding to their idea about competitors and firms don't want to cooperate with each other and competition is bad. First, competition is a very good thing for productivity and it's a good thing for people. Allowing these firms to compete with each other makes them drive down their prices, prevents monopolies, and generates economic prosperity and activity in the cases where they are similar firms. But secondly, just because they have well integratable industries doesn't mean they have like company A and company B, which are the same, but the only difference between them is one is in Japan and one is in South Korea. No, what this integration actually looks like is having access to limited resources and inputs which flow from one country across to the other. So what is an example of this? Hydrogen fluoride, which is a really important component of electronics, is massively produced within Japan. Due to the sour relations between the leaders and the disagreements and the unwillingness to get on the phone with each other and have a position of a close relationship, Japan has done things like capped the amount of hydrogen fluoride that South Korea has been able to access. So even though like 1/3 of South Korea's supply of this important electrical component comes from Japan, they could be getting a lot more of it from Japan, which means that it would be a lot cheaper and the inputs of all of their electronic goods would be much cheaper within that country. That means that South Korea would be able to enjoy probably millions, if not billions of dollars from having access to this freely available and very important input. It's not like they're the same thing. It's like they all have things that they send to each other and build upon to make final goods that can then be sold to consumers in China or in the rest of the world that flows back into their economy. But also, we tell you that you would enjoy a lot of economic advantages from the removal of tariffs, which would allow you to have a competitive advantage against other countries that are trying to use these resources to make good, which means that South Korea would always be the cheapest option and you would get all of the benefits from doing that. But also, we told you that you get shared know-how and technological innovations, that you get more resilient supply chains, that you get room to integrate and thrive in terms of having shared tourism, which noting that Japanese and South Korean tourism sending to and from each other is a massive proponent of both countries' tourism industries and has the potential to grow and be even more beneficial. But also you get things like robust regional health agreements, the ability to better manage pandemics together, to share vaccines, but also importantly, that in terms of your economy, you are no longer beholden to the flippant will of China because they're the only one that you're selling your goods to, right? Now that you are selling a big chunk to Japan as well, that doesn't just piss China off and like make them quit on you, right? It makes you robust to the day that they eventually do that in the future. Finally, on security, it's really important to be safe from North Korea, who have launched ballistic missiles in violation of the UN Security Council resolution, and Japan and South Korea can simply cover more ground together in terms of tracking those missiles and setting off alarms and practicing with the US to be safe. Join Team Biden, join Team Indo-Pacific Relations, and join Team Japan, because that is what is best for South Korea. So proud to.
Right, I thank DPM. I invite DLO.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The biggest lie that underpins this negative team's case is to insist to you that this is something that the South Korean government already is on a trajectory of doing, that somehow they're able to just magically wash away the decades of suffering that South Korea incurred because of Japan, both in the past and now. Firstly, this is just not true. Like, look at Brendon's speech. The last example he provides to you is instance of 2015. But we would just note empirically that the last and most recent defense white paper published by the South Korean government in 2021 refused to even name drop Japan as a partner of South Korea, let alone an ally. But secondly, at best, this negative affirmative team's framing is an argument for why we should embark on a slow, gradual tempering of South Korean-Japan relations. But what we explain is that this policy is a tectonic shift in Japan-South Korean relations. It is a betrayal of everything that South Korean government has proselytized for in terms of the issues in the past and in terms of their economic and security stances. And making that huge shift is just conceding an enormous sign of weakness to Japan, which means that Japan is likely to go harder to exploit that sign of weakness, which means that this agreement will be one that is always one that favors Japan more than it does South Korea. And that is why this affirmative team is out of this debate. The first question I'm going to ask is this something that South Korea would find morally conscionable? And I really want to stress the importance of this argument due to just how dismissive second affirmative was. Because second affirmative tries to mitigate this issue by saying, well, it's just past history. Firstly, many of the victims of this are still alive. My grandmother, who lives in Seoul, knows women were sold into sexual slavery to be comfort women for Japanese soldiers. And no amount of financial compensation is going to erase all those memories. But secondly, people know of people that were waterboarded by the Japanese police when Japan ruled over South Korea as a colonizer with an iron fist. But secondly, it's not just problems in the past. We also explain at CAT that many of these harms have translated into present political instability. Like, the reason why the chaebols exist, and if First Affirmative has a problem with them, the reason why they exist is because they were hand-picked elite by the Japanese government, which means that all the problems of caste conflict now, many people do blame upon Japan, which suggests that this is something that people will find it very difficult to go with, to know. What is second affirmative's attempt to flip this issue? They say, well, you need to start the conversation with Japan in order to gain forgiveness. That has two fundamental problems. The first is that the conversation has already started. Like, you don't need to be a diplomatic partner with Japan in order to critique Japan's imperialist history. Often, South Korea has used other channels, like talking about it in the UN General Assembly, talking about it in ASEAN to raise their concerns. And the problem is that the conversation has already happened and Japan is refusing to acknowledge it. Yes, they may have paid a few reparations to comfort women, but they never have refused to engage that it was a bad thing, and they also underestimate the scale of that. So, to the extent that Japan is continuing to refuse to admit it, what you are essentially doing is that you are saying that you forgive them even when you don't, which means that you are never able to get that kind of closure. That is why the second affirmative's attempt to flip this, in fact, proves the opposite. You are less likely to get that closure because you are applying a sign of weakness and you are betraying the values that you wanted to die on a hill for in the past. That is why already this negative team are out. Secondly, is this better for South Korea's military interests? The reason why I think this, in terms of the practical component debate, is the more important argument is for this very simple reason that the affirmative team never explained why South Korea is in such a dire economic situation that their material and economics is important. Like, yes, maybe South Korea is a middle income country, but it also still has one of the largest HDIs in the world. So any economic benefit or harm is therefore marginal in the debate. The greatest unique change in this debate is how it affects South Korea's military interests. But given that that is something that is totally unique to this debate. So what are the problems here? The first problem is that this affirmative team's case relies on the hidden premise that Japan and South Korea have a common foe in China. There are two responses to this. The first is to suggest that Japan is just as frightening a geopolitical threat to South Korea as is China. So what you are effectively doing is bringing the enemy closer to your doorstep. And there are three reasons for this. Firstly, we just point to the history of these nations, suggest that they're more likely to consider each other to be foes rather than allies. But secondly, empirically, the territorial disputes that Kat points to in her speech are a result of Japanese expansionism into South Korean waters. And there are two reasons for why that expansionism is likely to go into the future. The first is that Japan has a strong desire to return to its previous position as the Asian superpower. That there's a strong undercurrent of nationalism within Japan, that there's a desire to come back to imperial roots, which means that Japan ultimately is trying to seek out the ability to gain power over South Korea in this relationship to make sure that South Korea is subjugated by them in the long run. But secondly, we explained that expansionism is in Japan's interest because Japan is currently in dire straits, that due to the context of island shrinkage, which is exacerbated by climate change, it means that Japanese fish stocks and arable land are depleting, which means they need to claim land as part of the existential threat to their own shores. The upshot of that then is that what you're essentially doing by having a military relationship with Japan is that you are just allowing them to conduct their expansionism better. Like, to the extent that you are sharing military intelligence and doing joint naval exercises together, just gives the Japanese army a close-up look of what South Korea's naval defense looks like. So you are effectively aiding them in their conquest of your own waters. That is precisely the reason why you would never want to do this. But secondly, we would say that China is not an enemy of South Korea. In fact, it is South Korea's largest trading partner and an important stabilizing influence on North Korea. And that means that to the extent you buy Kat's material, which never gets a response, you antagonize China by allying with Japan. Therefore, you lose out on those economic outcomes. But critically, if Brendon is concerned about the threat of North Korea, China is South Korea's greatest ally in stabilizing North Korea for a set of reasons. Firstly, we will note empirically that when Kim Jong-un implemented his nuclear arms program, China actually cut exports in protest of that. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, because China has the incentive to maintain stability in that region. Because when there is conflict, China will incur most of the harm insofar there's an inflow of immigrants towards Chinese borders, insofar as the escalation of conflict between South and North Korea would most likely attract American influence. So it also brings American troops closer to Chinese borders, which means that China is doing everything it can to ensure that North Korea remain stable and does not further aggress, because that is also against Chinese interests. So to the extent that you have to choose between Japan and China, you all prefer China because China is South Korea's immediate partner, and it's already pre-established partner in curbing the North Korean influence, which Japan has obviously far less incentive because they don't have a stake in that geopolitical situation because of their relative distance from that situation. Literally, it does not affect them. So that is why that is out. So given that China is more important, it's not an ally, they're already losing on that front. But the second thing to say is that they never actually explain why it is necessary to have Japan as a political ally. Because they say, well, America would like South Korea and Japan to be together, but they never explain why the United States would no longer help you if you don't get along. And in fact, I would flip this. United States are less likely to aid you insofar as you've diminished your own relative importance to the United States. Because if you are helping Japan, you are effectively helping your direct ally, direct competitor in gaining the clout and the help from the United States. So again, this is something that aids Japan, and it's also therefore a blow to you. At the end of this, they have not explained beyond mitigation as to why the economic outcomes matter. We explain that this invites a direct existential risk to South Korea that is against their imperialist history for all these reasons we oppose.
Right. I thank Diallo for that speech. Invite Kafid.
Cool. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Fantastic. The logic of this negative team would have you believe that the EU could not possibly exist. Because in the span of 25 years, the countries of Europe fought 2 world wars, which an immeasurable number of atrocities were committed by each country against each other, not to mention the history of thousands of years of conflict that had come before. And nonetheless, that was exactly the reason why they sought closer ties, to prevent this from occurring in the future, to provide them the mechanisms to resolve those disputes and to allow those tensions to be put to bed, which is exactly why South Korea and Japan should form this relationship. The first thing I want to do is deal with really the only path to victory in this debate, which is just to demonstrate their strong ideological opposition domestically. I'll then rebut the rest of their ancillary material and then whip the 3 ways we must win. Let's engage with what they say on ideological opposition. This team correctly notes a set of historical tensions, but never does any of the work to weigh why it is that these are actually an impediment to this bloc forming or a reason why it should not. We have 6 responses. Firstly, we would point out that this is not unique to Japan as South Korea. As I alluded to in my introduction, Europe trades pretty aggressively and has strong relationships. Many African countries' strongest trade relationships are with their former colonizers. There's not a reason as to why you would not engage trade or diplomatic ties. Secondly, all of their reasoning applies to China equally so, which is the real death knell for this team that wanted to support a relationship with China as a comparative to a relationship with Japan, because China has also colonized Korea, because China supports and continues to support North Korea, because China literally invaded during the Korean War and committed countless atrocities against the South Korean people. So all of their reasons as to why it'd be ideologically opposed to this relationship must equally apply to their alternative. But thirdly, because Japan has taken very significant steps in order to try and work through those tensions. We talked through the fact that they apologized for comfort women in 2015, that there was reparations in 1965, a joint statement in 1998, and that comfort women agreement in 2015. They say, well, that wasn't enough. Yes, maybe that's the case that it's insufficient, but obviously compare that with the steps China's taken to right any wrongs, literally 0. And we point out that this is the best time to get concessions, which is argument 4, right? Like Shinzo Abe has just died. The nationalist wing of the LDP, which was most aggressive in being anti-Korean, has been discredited. And that means that the dubs are now in. If you want to get Japan to make concessions, if you want Japan to apologize for those things, now was the time to form a relationship because you could demand those things in return. And that was far more likely to be available. But lastly, we point out that obviously things like generational change weaken the extent to which this is a dominant force within South Korea. Obviously we're not saying people are forgotten. Obviously some people are still alive. Obviously that trauma can live on, but it weakens the extent to which it's the most dominant of a range of political issues that likely occur. Lastly, we point out that they need to weigh this material against the countless security and economic benefits that we point to, that we suggest time and time again countries tend to choose. Just look at all the other economic blocks that seem to work around these kinds of things. That defeats their only path to victory. What else do they have to say? They have a bunch of truly ludicrous domestic politics claims. The first response to them is just to point out that they're all contingent on you believing that first argument on ideological opposition, which has already been soundly defeated. But secondly, it also relies on you believing that this gets the far right elected. We'd point out that 1, elections tend to have more issues than just how do you feel about Japan. People probably also want to vote about like inflation, economics, feminism, which is a huge issue in South Korea because the treatment of women is often quite poor, and things like healthcare, which probably trump this on the issue list. Secondly, we point out that it's very likely that because we get concessions as part of this deal, we actually defang those arguments into the long run and make it far harder for the far right to ever get elected. Because when we successfully get them to apologize, when we get more reparations, when we get better agreements, that means that all that rhetoric vanishes from the public sphere. But even if the far right did get elected, their harms here just don't add up. They're like, well, you won't critique the prosecutors and the police. Yoon Suk-yeol, the current South Korean president, was a former prosecutor. Why would he go after his own office? That's where he came from. Secondly, they say, well, they'll do tax cuts. Why are tax cuts bad? Why are tax cuts not likely to happen under other governments? Really just a baffling paucity of analysis that they ought to be punished for here. Finally, they suggest this is bad for your relationship with China. 3 responses. Firstly, they provide no analysis as to why this is a tipping point in China cutting off ties, considering you host US military bases. You're one of the strongest US allies. You have historical tensions with China already. You're currently and still at war with North Korea, which China backs and supports and is the only reason that state still exists. And you already have disputed territories. but they're going to get mad that you and another country in the region are trading more and doing forming closer diplomatic ties. Ludicrous. No explanation as to why this changes anything. And we would say that if South Korea joining US military agreements didn't make them cut off ties, then joining Japan seems very unlikely to do so. But secondly, we'd point out that even if there was some harm to the relationship with China, it would likely be very minimal and would be outweighed by the benefits we talk about, which is that you probably want to reduce your economic reliance on China if you believe it's your greatest military threat. And if, for example, you've seen that it's very unreliable, as is the case in COVID, where, for example, supply chain disruptions have largely been caused by zero COVID lockdown policies in China and the refusal to engage in globalization anymore, and Xi's recent changes in how, trend inwards and move away from and move to sort of curb a number of very important Chinese companies, such as in the tech and edutech sectors, probably a reason you want to move away. This gets rid of literally all of their claims. Let's whip our remaining stuff. They have a couple of attacks on our case directly. They don't hold up. We explained to you a series of very important security benefits. They have a couple of responses. They say, well, you're foes, so you wouldn't be able to work together. Just shockingly bad analysis here. Honestly, don't know what to say. Secondly, they say Japan's only doing this because it wants to subjugate you. Well, one, that seems like a weird read. But secondly, even if that was the case, as long as this made South Korea stronger, which it would, because you get more free trade, because you're stronger militarily, who cares what Japan wants? It actually puts you in a stronger position that's less vulnerable to Japan. But thirdly, they say they suggest a truly ludicrous claim, which is that you should ally with China instead because it'll help with North Korea. One, what has it done so far? Two, why would it help a US ally that hosts US military bases? And three, obviously, China's the only reason North Korea keeps going. Compare that to the significant material we give you in terms of diplomacy, which is that, for example, this will radically improve your relationship with the US, which, for example, is very keen to see these kinds of things happen. And we would note that that is also the reason why it's likely that this team does have to disrupt an ongoing trend as they attempt to avoid many times. We explain the fact that Biden really wants strong ties in the Indo-Pacific region, suggests it's very likely he has been pushing for this. We point to empirical examples like South Korea forming working groups in order to get closer to Japan. We talk about things like the left wing of the LDP attempting to, distance itself from the right wing by making these overtures, all of which they do not respond to adequately. They just assert the opposite is true. We tell you could do things like have better missile tracking when you cooperate with Japan, which protects you from North Korea. We tell you could do joint exercises, which would be useful in improving your security. We tell you would probably get entry into things like the Quad. Notably, the reason South Korea was excluded was the US feared that tensions between Japan and South Korea might destabilize that. You can now be added into more relationships. Considering Japan has closer ties to the US than you do, it's very important that you minimize these ties because they're what often results in you being left out in the cold whenever there's some need to make a decision between you and Japan, which we usefully neutralize. Secondly, let's whip the economic benefits. They tell you two things in response. They say Japan is weak, so why would you want to ally with them? One, that is a concession that we would get really good deal here because we'd have the leverage to demand better free trade agreements. We have the leverage to demand more concessions around the ideological issues they say matter. But secondly, we'd point out Japan isn't that weak. It's still the fourth largest economy in the world. It's got tons of businesses. There's obviously a huge capacity to do trade. The second thing is you don't need economic benefits because you're already a rich country. Well, one, the power of compounding interest means if you improve your GDP growth by 2% a year, in 50 years, you double your economy instead of only, growing it by a quarter, which is massive. But secondly, we point out that obviously South Korea's problems with aging populations, people having to work too much, being able to improve the pension system, etc., would be massively beneficial. So proud to affirm.
Right, I thank Garfield for that speech. I invite Outwit.
Sorry, I just checked that I'm audible while I'm organizing everything.
Yep.
Sorry. All right. All right, I'm gonna start in 3, 2, one. First, on whether or not this is morally acceptable, where only we can win, then looking at the economics, where both teams can win, finally looking at the international implications, where that is also true. First question, is this a deal that this actor would find morally acceptable? This is clearly our fastest way to win the debate. The first thing I want to look at here is what are the interests of this actor? Because we're told by Udai that we need to weigh this. And in fact, we did that from CAP because their push that the interest here is economics, but we explain that South Korea already has one of the highest HDIs in the world. So the economic interest is not likely to be particularly large. Their ability to change isn't particularly large. We say that their primary interest is likely to be in not having a relationship with someone that you actively hate, that have committed war crimes against you. Their claim is this is illogical and crazy to hold war crimes against a country. This affirmative team cannot tell people that it is irrational and you should just get over it when we are talking about appalling war crimes, because I would say that it is not irrational. I would say that you are fully justified in having a problem with a country that has committed such egregious war crimes against you. So with that in mind, why do we tell you that they are likely to hate you? First, we explain that they colonized them, that they committed war crimes, that they refused to acknowledge the scale of those war crimes, and they can point to a few little agreements and statements, which we point out have consistently failed to acknowledge the scale and the actual harm that was done. Third, we point out they are literally still celebrating this happening. They are celebrating and having national holidays around the soldiers that committed these horrific war crimes, and we explain that this colonization continued later. Next, we explain that there are still territorial disputes, which are a sign of ongoing Japanese colonization against South Korea. And next, we explain an enormous amount of racism and xenophobia between the two ethnic groups that are involved here. What do they explain? Their first claim is, but China did it just as much. This is a lie. China fought on the side of the Korean government during the Korean War. They did not do the sets of colonization and war crimes that happened. Their next claim is, these people don't care anymore because we've had generational change. First, as we point out, the people who were the victims of this are still alive. And secondly, when you have things like massive war crimes that were committed, these are stories that get passed down from generation to generation. People are aware of the things that have happened. The idea that you would forget this kind of enslavement that happened is absurd. Their next claim is to say, this is not unique. Other sets of blocks have done this. My first observation is that pointing out that this is not unique is not a response to the fact that it is bad. But secondly, we point out that the examples they point to are very different, primarily for the reason that, for instance, Germany has consistently apologized for what has been done, whereas Japan is still literally celebrating the soldiers who did these war crimes. And we would say that where it is really bad, where there have been literal countries that still hate each other and still have these ongoing effects of colonialism, for instance, in the Balkans, these countries largely have not entered sets of deals for the reasons that we point out. Their next response is that now is a good time to extract a set of concessions because of the current domestic political situation to do with Shinzo Abe's assassination. First, this is an enormously long bow. The argument is like the crazy guy who shot Shinzo Abe was part of some occult thing and now has massively discredited a whole part of Japanese politics so you can get the change. I think this is probably just unlikely to be true. Second, I would say that this integration is a long-term process. So talking about the fact that there's some particular context right now doesn't really help this team because this process would continue after this current short-term context is gone. Third, hatred of South Korea in Japan is not like a niche political bloc, like something that only a niche political bloc cares about. It is deeply ingrained with the way in which Japanese people see them. So taking advantage of the domestic political situation it isn't enough. And fourth, even if they might better acknowledge what has happened, that doesn't delete the harm of you having to be friends with those sets of people. Their next claim is, they're both like secular and progressive. You don't like a country that committed war crimes against you because they're also a democracy. Finally, they say, we will fix this because Japan is now going to agree to understand and acknowledge what has happened. This is an exercise in optimistic assertion that Japan is now going to acknowledge what has happened. I think it is deeply unlikely that they will, for the reasons that we point out. That first of all, when you go now to closely integrate with them, you give up any bargaining power to get them to acknowledge that in the future. Second, it's unclear why Japan would agree when we point out that hatred of South Korea and xenophobia is so deeply ingrained within Japanese culture. And third, and this is the most important response, right? Even if they made it marginally better, even if Japan acknowledged 5% more that they did bad things, that is not sufficient to overcome the harm that we point out, which is that you now have to be friends with and help a country that did horrific war crimes against you. Acknowledgement of those war crimes is not sufficient to delete that harm. So why is it that we explain we wouldn't want to be in a relationship with the sets of people who have done this? First, we explain that you're now benefiting them. Second, we explain you now have to signal friendship. And third, it acts as a form of forgiveness, saying we have gotten over it, even when they refuse to acknowledge, even where you haven't, because there's ongoing trauma from that. You should weigh this the most highly in the debate for two reasons. Second, first, for the reason that it is certain to occur, it isn't contingent on unknowable economic analysis that's going to happen later. But secondly, the rest of the debate is highly marginal, as we point out, because South Korea is already a highly developed economy. Now, let us turn our attention to the economy. This team has three burdens in the economic material. First, they have to explain it will be a useful trading partner. Second, they have to explain that Japan would be someone that you could get things out of. And third, they have to explain that people would engage in this action anyway. Let's explain why they don't get it. The first thing I want to call out is that an enormous amount of this team's material here is attempting to intuition pump you with the word integration, that trade equals good things. But check your notes. Their claims here are crazy. Why is it that we explain that they would not be a good trading partner? Because Brendon acknowledges that they are similar. We point out, and this is very simple analysis, that trade is best when you have different sets of goods that you can trade. The fact that they're producing similar things means that they're less likely to be good trading partners. Second, we explain a set of reasons why Japan is just not likely to be looking particularly economically good at the moment. The fact they have an enormous balance of payments crisis, they have an enormous debt to GDP ratio, a hugely aging population, which means you can't extract a lot out of them. And finally, we explain to you that a free trade agreement doesn't actually get economic benefits. All it does is that it allows individual firms to enter into economic agreements. As we point out, because of the deep hatred between South Koreans and Japanese people, it's unlikely that the individual leaders of those firms would choose to enter into economic relationships because they can't fiat in that the businesses would do it. They can just fiat in that we would have a free trade deal. We explain that businesses would not take advantage of that free trade deal anyway, so it doesn't particularly matter. They make a couple more claims. The first thing they say, the bunch of claims that just kind of don't make sense. The first thing they say is, you're going to get more resilient supply chains. Another just like weird buzzword. Surely having domestic supply chains is more resilient. Next, they say you're going to deal with chaebols because you're going to have two governments rather than one, but you also have twice the number of large companies, right? So that doesn't make sense. Their next claim is you're going to have access to more free capital. First, we would say like South Korea is a highly financialized country that already has enough access to capital. Second, Japan doesn't have heaps of free capital. Much of their capital is held either holding their own government bonds or holding foreign government bonds. The next claim is that you're going to get rid of monopolies for the reason that you'll introduce competition. First, these firms are sufficiently large in both countries that they can still simply choose to collude to maintain the oligopoly. Second, it's not clear that these countries actually want to get rid of these monopolies. It isn't an accident that they had large monopolistic companies. It was a decision of industrial policy. That is how their economies are actually set up. So it's not even good to get rid of them. But finally, even if you believe that, we explain that China hates Japan and therefore is unlikely that you probably comes at an opportunity cost of your economic relationship with China. And we give you examples of where China has used its economic relationships previously to punish people for doing things that it doesn't like politically. For instance, when it punished Australia for speaking out against COVID, they make two claims. First, they say, but China already allows you to have your relationship with the US. The problem is your relationship with the US happened at a point where you were pre-existingly having that relationship with the US, where China wasn't powerful enough to do anything about it. But now when you're making a change to pivot towards Japan and China is in a position to do something, they will. The next claim is it's a bad relationship because you're relying on China. You should pivot to Japan anyway. The problem is that Japan cannot give you the sets of things that Cat tells you get from China. Things like a large enough consumer market, things like enough access to fossil fuels. So we win on moral acceptability, we win on the economy, and we point out that the US already has an enormous amount of ties to Japan. So it means to South Korea, so they're unlikely to abandon them on internet.
Right, I thank Obbit for the speech. Invite Ob reply. Yeah, reply whenever you're ready.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. First question I'm going to ask is Japan a geopolitical friend or foe? This is the quickest way for the negative team to win this debate for two reasons. Firstly, because the crux of this affirmative team's case is Japan and South Korea loosely share common interests. Therefore, joining together would help them mutually achieve those interests. But the claim that we make is that Japan and South Korea are competitors with respect to those interests, that they share common ideals insofar as every nation would like to be the regional superpower. But given that those interests were mutually exclusive, this policy would be essentially helping your enemy and therefore hurting yourself. But secondly, if you believe that we win this issue, that Japan is a geopolitical foe, then that way outweighs all of the economic benefits this affirmative team provides for three reasons. Firstly, because it incurs a moral harm, and that is certain, whereas the economic benefits that this team relies upon are necessarily less speculative. Secondly, because it is the revealed preference of South Korea to be oppositional to Japan. And this is where the affirmative team's frame of this is part of the natural trajectory towards change was something that was insufficient. They never proved it. And in fact, we explained that even if a natural trajectory was ideal, this policy was not commensurate to it, that it was a rapid and tectonic shift in relations that conceded an enormous sign of weakness that allowed Japan to predate upon South Korea and never answer for the wrongs that were incurred. But the last reason to explain why this outweighs the economic benefit is on the question of imperative. Because we explain that Japan is actually trying to directly challenge Korean waters, and this harm exacerbates a direct danger that South Korea is facing. Whereas their imperative on their economic benefits is South Korea is already a wealthy country, perhaps it can be more wealthy. That is marginal, whereas our harm is there much less so, and therefore something that we all prioritize. So why is it that we win this issue? On two metrics. The first is that we explain that it worsens regional conflict. Secondly, on international allies. They never respond to the first one as we provided second and negative, that Japan is literally contesting waters and that the sharing of diplomatic intelligence compromises the ability of South Korea to defend its own borders. No response. But their only responses are to our arguments on international allies. We say that it makes you lose China. They say, well, it helps the United States like you more. The problem with their benefit is that they never explain why it is mutually exclusive, i.e., why in the absence of this policy, you would lose United States favor. But as we explained from first and down the bench, it is very unlikely that this affects the ability of South Korea to maintain ties with North Korea as America due to simple path dependency, the fact that it helped South Korea establish as a nation. So even if you buy the mitigation they give to our harm, which is that you lose China, that is insufficient because they never explain why their harm could even occur, whereas we explain that this at least pushes China in the direction of antagonizing South Korea, and you therefore lose all of the economic benefits and the problems of geopolitical stability that you get from China. So given that we've conclusively won that issue, this affirmative team is substantially down in the debate. But the second way that we beat them is we just beat them by their own terms by considering the second question in this debate on economic benefits. The extent of their case is free trades are good. Therefore, this relationship gets more free trades. We provide two useful responses. The first is that we explain a third that free trades are at best an opportunity to invest, but given that as they concede, we are talking about firms, Japanese and South Korean firms that are competitors to one another, they would not take this opportunity to invest, so therefore their benefit was null. But secondly, this assumes that these trade deals were done in a way that equally favored both countries. But as we explained, Japan was in greater economic strife than they would South Korea. So necessarily this was something that was more useful to Japan, given its very low interest rates rather than South Korea. But furthermore, we explained that given that this is something that South Korea wasn't willing to do anyway, and the fact that they've shown an enormous concession indicates that any subsequent trade deals will be made against South Korean interests and are more likely to be unfair to them. For those reasons, we oppose.
Right, I thank the op reply. I invite the gov reply.
For a moment. Just a moment, sorry. Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Just take a moment to think about what side negative actually offer the South Korean people in this debate. Because they do not offer the South Korean people a chance of getting any apology from Japanese politicians. They just say you should never cooperate or engage with the Japanese. And they instead offer the idea that you should wait for Xi Jinping's China to forget that you have US military bases on your soil and that the promise or the potential promise of one day maybe getting a security alliance with them would be better, despite how much that would irritate the Americans. They don't really have any positive material that explains an alternative course of action that South Korea could do to maximize the welfare of its people. And it's for that reason they lose the round. The first question I'll ask in this reply is how will this set of moves to move close towards Japan be interpreted by the South Korean public? And the reason from starting here is all the side negatives material on why this would be very upsetting to the South Korean public is contingent upon the public interpretation of these moves as seen as weak and concessionary to Japan, which is to say, all of their moral harms are contingent on us not getting any symbolic concessions like apologies from the Japanese. But what side affirmative effectively explain is that Japan would be eager to respond to these moves with those symbolic concessions. The first reason for this is given at first affirmative, where affirmative explained that the hawkish wing of the LDP had been discredited because Shinzo Abe was assassinated. The reason he was assassinated because of his connection with a particularly unpopular cult, and Abe was the leader of the nationalist wing who was the most anti-apology. Third negative kind of misunderstands what we're talking about there, thinks the assassinator was part of the cult, but we explain precisely why actually the mood within the LDP at the moment is very anti-nationalist. The factional balance of power there has shifted in favor of people who are more dovish. The second reason affirmative give is just to point out that the side negative's own material explains why Japanese would make these concessions, because the other side repeatedly tells you at each speaker that Japan's economy is weak and they would be desperate for a trade deal which could improve their standing. Despite third negative adding kind of new substantive about how Japanese people dislike South Korea, which I don't think you should count, we would just note that it's often the case that countries rationally, avoid their own kind of, potential hang-ups they might have in return for economic gain if they're in such a serious, dire economic straits as they claim. The final thing they claim here is that, this empowers the South Korean far right, and that would be bad. We have 3 responses at third affirmative. 1, the election outcomes determine other things. 2, this would actually in the long run defang the far right because their core complaints have been answered. And 3, the impacts of the far right being elected, the only which they can point to is tax cuts isn't bad, neg block never responds. It's clear that within South Korea, this would be seen as an incredibly positive thing, and the government would be winning concessions from the Japanese in a way that would actually empower the government, make people feel like their answers have been heard. So yes, this is a flip of every single time they get up and talked about the moral pain the South Korean people experience. Second question, the reply. Which relationship brings a larger set of benefits? Firstly, on security. The key negative claim is that China would be upset and they're a better potential partner. 2, 1, side affirmative point out you already host US military bases. But 2, we also point out that China supports North Korea, which is the single largest threat. The second negative say that China will sometimes sort of curbs North Korea's behavior, but that simply isn't compared to the weighing you hear at second affirmative, which explains why the ability to track missiles is just a way more direct and better security benefit. They then say Japan might be a threat. We would point to the fact they're in the same security bloc as that being unlikely. We point to the fact that the US would never rely, and we point to the fact their own material suggests that Japan is weak and wouldn't really be able to affect that threat anyway. So were it the case that was a problem, we've dealt with it. The final issue is on the economy. They have 3 key claims here. Side negative firstly say they're just kind of very eager to say it wouldn't really matter because they say the word HDI a bunch. We explain at second affirmative that in fact competition is very good because it increases real incomes by lowering input costs, and there are a set of regular financial reasons to receive sparse response at third neg, which explain why more capital gets invested. They then say that Japan is weak. We point out that's the reason you get a great trade deal, because they're weak and you can make concessions. They say, oh well, you might want to rely on China in the future. We say it's good because China is increasingly antagonistic and willing to use their economic relationships to extract concessions. We move away from them by moving closer to Japan. All of this material, political and economic benefits, fall to side affirmative. They have no positive case for how they would improve the lot of the South Korean people. They lose the round.
Settle ito. Right. Thanks for the round. So we generally thought this was a good round, very close. The panel was split 1-1. As the chair, my vote ended up in a casting vote, and I voted on half-point margin to the negative team. So I think that there are three main issues that happened in the debate, that swing it the way it went. The first big one was ideology. Op make the claim that ideology is an auto win. It's not, right? But it is an issue that I think is fairly brought into the debate. And I think Op does a good job, as Gov concedes to some extent, of explaining that there is this tension or ideological moral problem, basically. How does the Gov deal with this? The DPM's angle response is basically an attempt to flip and say that we solve for this better. So this premises itself on me believing that Japan would change its behavior and therefore be able to have some form of collaboration at this point. There are a few things that are said by Gov to back up this claim. The first thing is that there is some capacity for the LDP now to shift towards an apology. Opwave has a response to this. I honestly am not educated enough about Japanese politics to be able to call that one way or another. I am willing, I am willing to give some charity to both claims and posit that maybe there is some shift towards some degree of dovishness. Second, can't read my handwriting. Yeah, so that's I think the first big claim, and this follows through to claims about how there's time to get this is the best time to get concessions. But again, that rests on me believing that the Japanese government would be willing to give these concessions. The next thing that is claimed, I think, along this line of Japan will change behavior, is a claim that Japan has already made some changes in behavior. For example, previous apologies for comfort women. Here, I think Op is correct to respond to say that there is a general sentiment in Korea that this is insufficient apology. For what happened in 2015 is insufficient, and that some degree of hate still exists. At this point, then, I think while I acknowledge that Gov might be able to prove that there is some change in Japan towards changing the way in which they treat South Korea, the problem is that this doesn't grapple with the sheer burden that reality places on you on Gov, which is that this idea of an apology from Japan and an acknowledgement of guilt is which Op frames and Gov kind of concedes is the kind of change that would be closure is really, really significant in Japan. And that scale of change in behavior from Japan is not something I think you are able to prove. So you all give reasons, yes, but I don't think they reach up to the burden that is taken on when you say it changes behavior towards Japan being nicer. GovWhip then pushes out a few other responses to this ideological claim that I think are kind of worth talking about. The first that is about uniqueness, but I think Opwave is right. Proving that other people got over it doesn't mean that I should expect Korea to get over it and I don't think you'll prove either what are the processes by which Korea would be likely to get over it. The interesting attempt to prove this is to say generational change in GovWhip. I think Opwave is correct to point out the extent to which this generational change kind of doesn't happen because of the extent of deep-seated ideological harm ideological anger that exists within Korea. The final push that I want to talk about is this China push in whip speech. And I actually think this is really interesting as a rebuttal. But because Op frame it as about being against your morality, then the debate is about how tensions exist and how this moral hatred exists, not how it should exist. So in other words, I'm willing to buy that it might not be completely rational to prefer China to Japan. But I think this is not something that you can debate by structural reasons, but rather something that must be debated by the reality of it. And I think the reality, as Op point out, is that the extent of latent hatred against those particular war crimes, for example, that Japan committed is a lot more significant within what I understand of the Korean national consciousness. Consequently, I think that there is a question to be asked about, what does it mean as a result of this ideology? LO tries to say, there are some domestic politic harms that accrue. I do think that GovWhip is able to take most of this out, which means that what we are left with is what reply claims is a negative case from the Op, right? Or the neg, which is to say, it is basically we don't want to show signs of friendship and show signs of forgiveness. So that, I think, is the end point of ideology at this point in the debate. With that in mind, I want to talk about other issues, right? So on economics, I actually think economics is a fairly straightforward gulf win in terms of there will be some change, right? That happens, because I think that most of the op responses come in op whip, and I clearly am unable to credit that to the degree of credit that I actually think they deserve. However, what I do think is that, and I also think, and this also helps Gov, that just because something is marginal does not mean I should not value it in the debate. So I think that at this point, that I do believe that there is some ideological harm that is going to be done, and this turns into a moral harm kind of thing. And I also believe that there is some economic benefit that could be done as a result of this of being closer to Japan. So finally, there's the issue of military geopolitics kind of thing. So I think that a lot of these deadlocks, because this issue of like, you can track missiles better from Gulf, and then Op says, well, now you need to give a bit more info to Japan, and this might eventually be used by Japan against you, territorial disputes, etc. I think the extent to which I believe that this missile tracking is a significant change is not something that I think is proven, especially given, like, so I accept that you're being excluded from the Quad, but the extent to which this is significant is unclear to me. I think this second angle of being an alternative to China, again, I'm willing to buy that you could be an alternative. I don't understand the extent to which this is true on your side of the house. The final thing I'll note on military geopolitics is that, like, there's a lot that goes on in the debate about whether this will make you break relationship with the US, break relationship with China. I think these are all at a level that is relatively asserted, i.e., yes, I believe there is some frustration that exists vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the US, from China or from the US. Nobody actually takes this to the level of saying, therefore, ties will break. In fact, both sides make the opposite rebuttal to say, no, ties are not going to break as a result of this. And in all honesty, like, I think on both sides, these are fairly compelling rebuttals, which means that I think this military geopolitical pragmatic discussion is not that significant as a tipping point in the debate. At this point, what we get into is, I think, the broad weighing of the round. And this is where I think the debate really moves very slightly to the op. Because as much as I think the debate was good, I think it's really frustratingly lacking in the whole debate issue versus issue comparison. So what I mean by this is, everything that I've said about how the economics and like an attempt to make like whatever military thing unique, the impacts of this are not really blown up by the Gulf side, right? There's not a lot of explanation as to what this economics can do. Now, this is not to say that I buy that just because that this marginal thing automatically means it's excluded. But I think what Op is able to prove with the HDI thing is to say that you are not that desperate. Not to say that the change is not significant, but you're not that desperate for the change because you're already in a good position. At the point that is the Op's claim, right? Then Gulf's response to this is basically to attempt to say towards the end of Udai's speech, look, there's still a significant capacity to increase, and South Korea has some problems that they want to solve. I think that these two are plausible, but the extent to which I believe that the problems are significant enough that it means that this economic benefit should outweigh the morality of it all is, I think, very uncertain. In contrast, in fairness, because I don't buy the pragmatic implications of the morality, like, it's not like Op gets a big win here. And this is where I struggled about whether I'm like stepping in my position as, I guess, ex-Japanese colonized country. But what I do think is proven by the Op is that ideology and the framing of this ideology as a moral hurt and the specific things like you have to show forgiveness, those become more direct and those become more direct impacts on people and their values, right? At that point, what that means is that the emotive harm is something that I think is proven by Op, and I don't think is disputed sufficiently by Gulf. That emotive harm weighs against an economic harm that I'm uncertain why it is more important than the immediate emotive harm that Op says exists. And while I don't think they give like structural reasons for me to believe, or analytical reasons to believe that this is true, I think the characterization of the way in which this hurts people is sufficient for me to believe that I should weight these emotive harms over the economic benefits, which I don't think are as clearly tied into what the people want. So consequently, on that basis, I think on a very narrow margin, Op takes the win. I think the split reveals that this could have gone a different way with a different panel of judges, or indeed if my training was a panel. But yep, that's the call I came to. If you all want feedback, I'm happy to do it here, preferably not recorded.